Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're in the home stretch now, and we really want to thank you for an incredible amount of feedback today, and also some fantastic energy and passion around these issues. And so we've talked about how decisions are made. We've talked about financial and other decision-making information that's required by citizens and by the city. We've talked about how the public can be more effectively engaged. We've talked about how to balance priorities in the books, and I was able to sit in very briefly on some of the incredible debates that happened downstairs. And of course, we've had some exceptional pitches from citizens offering their best ideas, and you're going to hear the results of that process in just a few minutes. So the first thing, though, is just to hear from our closing panel, where you've got some very senior folks at the city who are going to share their perspectives on the ideas and suggestions that they heard that particularly stood out, as well as initial thoughts on what they've heard and the connection to improved governance, decision-making, and long-term financial sustainability for the City of Toronto. So introducing the panel, from your left to your right, there's Chris Brillinger, who is Executive Director of Social Development, Finance, and Administration, followed by Michael D'Andrea, who's Chief Engineer and Executive Director of Engineering and Construction Services, followed by Josie, who's Executive Director of Financial Planning, and finally, the gentleman you met at the beginning of the day, Rob Rossini, who is the Deputy City Manager and CFO. So maybe I'll just invite them to speak in that order, just to offer a few brief thoughts on what they heard and what its implications might be. So starting with Chris.
Great, thank you. And thanks to all of you for sharing in the joy, pain, and challenge that is long-term financial planning for the City of Toronto. The afternoon has been very interesting, and one of the themes that I heard both in pitches, in debates, was around the notion of pay now or pay later, and a number of dimensions to that issue. First dimension is building needed infrastructure. The example was the Eglinton subway that was started, then stopped, and now we have the crosstown. Second dimension is maintaining our existing infrastructure, that if we're not paying for it now, we end up paying more later. Toronto Community Housing might be an example of that. The third dimension is investing in prevention as opposed to cure. So investing in services where we're providing, where people just need a little bit of support rather than waiting until they need a whole lot of support and spending a lot more money. And the fourth dimension is the environmental elements of decisions and factoring the full environmental costs of decision making. So all of that was around the better data that we have in this respect, the better decision making that we'll make, or the better financial decisions that we make. And I guess the most significant outcome of that is if we are going to defer costs, kick decisions down the road, and basically pass on costs to future Torontonians, let's be deliberate and transparent about making those kinds of decisions. In terms of revenue sources, the interesting idea I heard was there's a whole lot of money sitting in pension funds right here in this city, and how do we figure out how to access that source of capital, and the term is patient capital, and are there ways of accessing that patient capital to address some of those infrastructure costs? The last comment I want to pass along, one of my colleagues heard, and that is that aspirations are important. Where are we without dreams? Thank you.
Fantastic. Michael.
Okay, like Chris, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for spending a beautiful Saturday afternoon stuck inside City Hall here with us, and so it's much appreciated, particularly on this critically important initiative for the city. So a couple of things that I heard as I traveled across the different sessions. One is that, the old saying is that you can never communicate enough. And I think the same holds true for our budget process. So what I heard is that we need to do a much better job in communicating the major achievements and the projects that we've completed in a given year. And, the corollary to that is we obviously need to do a much better job in communicating the funding sources that we have that feed into our budget process. Not an awful lot of discussion around development charges. When you see the boom in development that we see, particularly the condominiums, how is that money being used, and how are we realizing that revenue stream, and what sort of projects and initiatives is that revenue being directed to? Not only in terms of how we spent those kinds of revenues, but in terms of the next 5 or the 10-year plan, is how do we envision those additional revenues to be directed towards what initiatives and projects? The other is, and to be honest with you, it was a bit daunting for me to have a look at that slide. I mean, been in the city for a number of years, and I'm more familiar in terms of my area of responsibility, but to see the number of longer-term plans that we have developed as an organization, it is quite daunting. I mean, I was speaking to somebody, and they actually had to reduce the font size to get them all on one of those big poster boards. So one of the comments that was made is that while we have all of these great plans, wouldn't it be nice if we could integrate them into one complete and comprehensive plan? But perhaps more importantly is to identify those elements of those plans for which we have funding in place, or for which we are recommending funding to be in place as part of our annual budget process, and we do that early on in the process, in the budget cycle. And then, following on with that is, we shouldn't create a plan or an idea for a new project without a confirmed funding source. The notion that we are anticipating or hoping, to rub the genie lamp at the fact that there's going to be a magical funding source appear, whether it be other levels of government or some other revenue stream, is perhaps a non-starter. Let's make sure that we have confirmed funding at the time that budget that recommendation for a project is put forward. One of the other things I heard was a novel idea, certainly in a City of Toronto context, is looking at citywide ward-based participatory budget. It's an idea that one of our councillors has advanced and certainly used in her ward in the early stages, certainly in this past budget cycle. Idea that apparently is used more fulsomely in Chicago. To make that effective, it requires that kind of an approach across all 44 wards and buy-in from all of our councillors. But something to certainly keep in mind, and the idea being is that we're an investment, a budget allocation is assigned on a ward basis, and then it's the community that helps decide the priorities to meet the needs of that community, which would be rather different one ward to another. And then lastly, it's the need for politicians to do a better job in advocating for the aspirational projects that Chris mentioned. But perhaps equally important is to pitch for the necessary additional revenue to support. Again, it's not a question of pitching for an aspirational project, but being realistic in terms of the funding that's necessary to see that project through to fruition.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Some interesting observations there about participatory budgets, and I think Lord of the Rings fans may find it appealing to hear about the one plan to rule them all. So terrific. Let's go over to Josie.
Thank you. So I spent most of my time in the council chamber talking about financial information that we use for decision making. So I didn't get a great opportunity to actually hear others, but I did spend some time a bit upstairs to look at our wonderful decision-making map, and saw some of the posts there. And what it essentially told me was something that I think has come out in various different places, and that's really that we need council to really set priorities either at the beginning of the term of council, and to think about, what are those intended outcomes that they want, and that we can actually use that as a way to determine what's the vision for the city, how do we then get there, and of course, what is the information that we use, whether it's around targets or outcomes, to actually determine whether we're making our way down the road. I think there was one comment one of my colleagues heard was, why would we go and seek new powers if we're not using the powers that we have? And so I would say that, that's a validation for me that says that really where we need to help support council is in thinking as a group about what is it that it's intending to do as a city, what is its vision, which is, I think, one of the themes of this consultation is, what is the city that we want and how do we get there? And then what information do we need to help support that? Having spent most of my day with a lot of folks who are very interested in city data and information, that is really key in helping us all determine whether what we are doing and how we're allocating our resources, how we're spending the time we're spending on the services that we provide is actually adding value and actually having an impact in the community, because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, is to serve the public. And so we need to learn how to connect those things. We have information and needs to get organized in a way that allows people then to understand what the city is doing, so that we are both transparent and accountable to the public in the services that we provide. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Josie. And it was really interesting sessions we had that Josie participated in here, with some great feedback from Budgetpedia and the Open Data Book Club. It's worth checking them out online too. So we'll go over to Rob, who had the first word today, and he'll come close to having the last word, but not quite, because you're going to get the last word.
Almost the last word.
Almost.
So I've a lot of interesting ideas. People would come up to me today and say, hey, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. So here's about a half dozen or so quick fire things. One, change the MLTT and the provincial land transfer tax and the municipal land transfer tax so that the vendor pays it and not the seller. And that may curb speculation just by who has to pay the tax. Pretty cool. We know there's some people out there have an aversion to paying higher taxes. So one person came up to me, we should have a more broader-based tax deferral increase program. So where someone can defer their increase of their taxes for some period out in the future, you charge them interest, city can borrow money at a much lower interest rate than what you would charge then the person or the homeowner, and then we would cover our costs by the interest differential. So if someone could defer tax increases, till they appoint till 10 years, 20 years out, or till they sell the house, maybe those tax increases would be more palatable. Something to think about. An idea to develop more intensely the air rights over our transit stations. I know that's something we're going to look at on the potential to do that for the new Smart Track stations, but also existing TTC stations. Develop the air rights more intensely. Another quick idea was have online donations for specific capital projects. People will be more apt to give money if they knew it was going to something specific, so have online donations for specific capital projects. And then another idea, this is one of my favorites, is graduated tax rates, or higher tax rates for higher valued properties. I think that's actually something that we should be doing and need to be doing. And that's it.
All right. Okay. Compelling perspectives from each of our panelists. We do have a little bit of time. We've budgeted to go till 5 o'clock, and I know you want to hear from those involved in judging the coolest ideas. But there is a few minutes for the panel to take questions or comments from you. And my colleagues, Brendan and Alex, have microphones. Please, we don't want long speeches here, folks. Enough of that happens at City Hall. But we would welcome any questions or brief observations. Okay, so this lady over here.
Hello, my name's Maureen, and I would love to thank the sign people for all their hard work.
Thank you so much. City staff work very hard, and they're here on weekends too, so that's very kind. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Amanda Kane, and I'd like to say thank you for the excellent summary of the panel. This is probably one of the best summaries I've ever heard, like, in a decade. So I want to thank you all for that. And I'm just wondering what the next steps are. Are you going to be putting together that summarized information for council, or is it another report?
Yes, so thanks for the question. So we'll be summarizing everything that we've heard, not just through this phase of the consultations, but the previous phase as well. And we owe a report to council, which will likely come in the fall, later this year, where we will take the input that we've heard and lay out some potential strategies and options for council. So yes.
Okay, there's a gentleman with the mic right up there.
Hello. Good afternoon. My name is Tim Lyons. I just have a question regarding the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. Do you feel like there's going to be a lot of opportunity for projects similar to maybe what's going on in Montreal with the LRT, and what impact do you think that'll have on our capital funding moving forward?
So we don't have a lot of details about the Canada Infrastructure Bank. It did get an allocation of funding, and I forget what the number is, 5 billion, I think it is, maybe 10 billion. And there was language in the federal budget about there'll be a combination of assistance through loans, possibly grants, or possibly equity injections, or possibly low-interest loans. So we don't have a lot of detailed information of how this money will be made available. So it's kind of early to speculate in terms of what kind of an impact it will have on our capital plan. I'm always an optimist. More is better than less. So having an infrastructure bank with some money behind it, obviously it should help. We just can't really quantify how much right now.
Okay, right up here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tonya Foster. I just wanted to thank the city for opening this forum to take everybody's individual feedback. I think it's very important to keep these open forums from the city and community members. Just would like to address the centralized waiting list with housing. You said you were going to take suggestions and ideas which would be reported to implement for next year, but based on the time frame and the urgency of this particular focus that Tori has addressed, how can we position our suggestions to be received to kind of transition with that timeline and results he's looking for?
I'm going to look to Chris, who's heading up the response to the Tenants First Task Force on that.
So the staff have received council direction to report on ways forward for Toronto Community Housing, which is the 58,500 housing units that the city ultimately owns. We're going to be reporting out on some advice to council in June on how to begin to move forward. The province has provided some additional tools, so we're looking at how we can maximize those tools to start to move through the waiting list. We're working with Toronto Community Housing to figure out how we can get people into units faster. So everything that we can possibly do within the existing resources and tools, we will move forward with. The larger, longer-term question about how do we start to significantly chip away at that waiting list remains an open question for the long-term fiscal plan.
Okay, right over here.
So from the beginning of this process, the organizational charts for what we're talking about have been confused because there have been three separate things and they've tried to fit them into two categories. And no matter how we do that, we always end up leaving one of them out, even though supposedly they're all in there somewhere, but they're not. So the three things are expenditure choices, as in which divisions get more and which get less, efficiencies, and revenue. Somehow we try to fit that into two categories of expenditure and revenue when there's actually three, and then we fail to talk about the divisional expenditures and what people want to see the city actually do. We had a very detailed breakdown of possible revenue sources, and people were asked to say which ones they liked and which ones they didn't. Now, we still need to do that with expenditures because the efficiency question is not the expenditure question. The expenditure question is, for each and every division in this city, should we do more? Should we do less? Any other comments on how those divisions work? That's what we need to do at the same level as was done with revenue, because we know that certain parts of the city need more money or want more money. And it's so much more than can possibly come from revenue that unless we also get some of that money by shifting expenditures, we'll never have enough for housing and transit, which we know are the ones that want much more money. We need to have a third round of consultations so that we can do a division by division discussion of how people want expenditures to be spent.
Okay, so we'll invite the panel to address the comments.
Maybe if I can just comment on that. The point is well taken, and thank you. The expenditure discussions around the long-term fiscal plan have been at a higher level, more at the priority level, and you know, we welcome if there was if people wanted a more detailed discussions. The division by division kind of expenditure discussions does occur. It occurs every year at the budget time.
Why do we do revenues in such detail? It's not a question of detail. It's a question of the fact that the possibility of getting money for housing from another budget keeps getting dismissed. Even the staff on this panel has said things like, well, how can we do that unless we have revenue? Well, that's not true. We can do it by taking it from other budgets that are being unnecessarily paid.
Absolutely, and that's the discussions that around priorities is around that, and the discussion that occurs at budget. Does it happen as effectively as you may want it to occur? Probably not, but yeah. Okay. Budget is the allocation of scarce resources among competing divisions. So
okay.
Point well taken, and thank you.
So we'll go right over here, please.
I'm Tom Smart. I got a lot of ideas, and I'll send them in by email. This isn't the time to continue pummeling. But I do have a question, as I've followed the budgetary process over quite a few years, about, you know, at the very end, scrimping and seeing, well, what do we need to cut because our expenditures are a little bit over budget, and how can we make it all balanced, et cetera, et cetera. With this Scarborough one-stop subway, which from what I've read was originally budgeted for $2 billion, and now it's gone up to $3.5 billion. So in less than 2 years, that's a $1.5 billion increase over what was initially expected. That's a lot of swimming pools to have to close down to cover that. And I just wonder how many people really honestly think that the cap of $3.5 billion for the one-stop Scarborough subway is going to actually stay at that level over the construction period of several years into the future, and how is that going to be funded?
So let me just correct something for the record. The Scarborough subway was never budgeted or cost estimated at $2 billion. The LRT, which was going to be provincially funded, was in and around that $2 billion mark. The budget, the original budget for the Scarborough subway is and always has been $3.56 billion. It's now been revised and de-scoped from three stops to one stop, and it's in around that $3.4 billion mark right now. Council has directed staff to do what we call a stage gating process. We're going to take the design to 30%. When we have more detailed design at the 30% level, because right now it's only about 5% designed, we will have new cost estimates, and then at that point, council will then make another decision about whether to go and tender the project and do it.
Okay, so there's a follow-up question over here.
Slightly different area. So I'm looking at the sort of where the money comes from, and with the overheated housing market in Toronto, do you feel if they take steps, or the steps that have taken may put at risk the land transfer tax revenue that we're going to see, and potentially what strategies are you going to mitigate for any losses that were affected? I mean, we looked at what happened within Vancouver, and there's some downward pressure on the budget. Are we looking at that?
So I wish I had a crystal ball, because that's an excellent question. Will the 16 measures introduced by the province, in particular the foreign land the foreign buyer speculation tax? Will it have an impact on cooling the real estate market such that our MLTT, municipal land transfer tax revenues, decline? We have an exposure, right? $716 million in the budget. I just don't have a crystal ball of what will likely happen. There were lots of things at play in Vancouver and BC. The tax was introduced. They saw about a 20% decline in sales. You get a 20% decline here in our revenues. That's $140 million. And then Josie here, how are you going to fix that problem? What's our strategies?
Okay. So was that a rhetorical question? Or?
Well, actually, we do have some strategies built in. Okay.
All right.
So
okay.
we do have a $40 million cushion in that the first $40 million of the MLTT is budgeted in capital. And, you know, we always know we don't spend all our capital budget, so we do have a bit of a cushion there. Anything beyond that, you know, we'll have to put our thinking caps together and see what to do.
All right. I thought for a moment we'd gone from the public asking the panelists questions to the panelists asking each other questions.
Yeah.
So I'm
No,
glad
no, we
didn't
have
go
some
there.
answers.
All right. So we've got a question right over here.
I just came in recently, so if you covered this, you can just tell me it's been covered. But my concern is over climate action. It's going to be very expensive for the city to do what's needed over the next decades leading up to 2050. And we're getting the plan this week from the Transform TO staff for the 2050 80% reduction in CO2 emissions. It's going to be a big program. And are we figuring that in? It's got to be figured in. We have to do it. It's extremely expensive not to take the action and not to take it as soon as possible. And as we know, City Council didn't actually fully fund what the program could have done this year in 2017. So how are we going to make sure that we actually have the proper funding for that going forward? And let's build it into this projection. So tell me if you're on that already. Thanks.
Has not come up today, so at least not in this session. So
energy and environment is one of the divisions in my cluster as deputy city manager. I know it's in the report. It's coming out, our Transform TO report. There's going to be a series of short-term, medium-term, and long-term measures to hit those very, very aggressive 80% targets by 2050. Are they all funded? Absolutely not. I don't know if you saw upstairs, there was a nice board that had a whole list of master plans and service plans that are either in the works or approved. Transform TO is one of them. And, you know, it's going to be difficult to try to fund all of those measures. The Transform TO program, though, I would point out, it's not going to be done alone by the city. It points out a number of investments that need to be made by both the city, yes, but also the federal government, the provincial government, homeowners, business owners, and the private sector. So I don't have how it's going to be funded yet.
all right. Sure. Any final questions? Okay. Oh yes, sir. One over there.
Thank you for that nice segue. In the discussion, you talked about revenue tools, and there was in the previous section a whole discussion about a variety of things that were available to the city. City Council decided on road tolls, went up to Queen's Park and were rebuffed. The three major revenue tools that were in that discussion, a city sales tax, a corporate income tax, and an individual income tax in the City of Toronto, obviously need a lot of discussion with Queen's Park, with Ottawa. Can you tell us where staff is on those discussions, where council is on those discussions, because that's $1.5 billion a year of new revenue.
It's true, council passed those resolutions, and I believe it was the next morning, Provincial Finance Minister Charles de Sousa said there is no discussions on sharing the HST. That came out the morning after, so it's going to be a long haul. Municipalities have asked for access to either a sales tax or the HST or corporate and personal income taxes. That's not happening anytime soon that I know of. But, you know, should municipalities keep plugging away at that? Absolutely. Council wants that to happen. Those discussions, we meet periodically with our counterparts as deputy ministers at the province. Are we making progress on that? No. I'll be frank.
Okay, so quick comment from Josie.
Before, I think, are we done with our questions?
We have one final question.
I just wanted to say that as we're sitting here, I wanted to acknowledge we have a counselor here, Counselor Davis, who has joined us this afternoon, and just wanted to introduce her.
Okay, so this gentleman over here gets the last question, because we do want to keep our promise to get you out of here on time.
Not so much a question. I came in hopes of getting a better understanding as to why there were service cuts across the board to the people that need it the most. And when we're discussing ways and means to finance or fund programs that are essential, we don't look at the things that aren't being taxed. For example, corporate has a lot of buildings that they put up around the downtown core, okay? They occupy these buildings. I'm not saying per square foot, but there are tools that could be implemented that are in place that the government really don't look at when they look at how to generate funds. The ideas that I know I can put forward would most likely be rejected by corporate, because road tolls, how many trucks on the road every day? All day, every day. There are lots of ways by which those who have can put forward. When it was called for the revitalization of the waterfront, the money came. And it's that same attitude that Toronto needs to improve. I take part in a lot of discussions around the improvement of Toronto, and I don't see anybody implementing anything. And that's my last word. I want to see implementation of these ideas, and it's got to start somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you for that very compelling advice. It's a fitting final word, and I hope you'll join me in thanking the panel for their comments today. And of course, thanking the questioners for some really, really interesting and thought-provoking points.